Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I will try to keep this video a little bit shorter. So this is primarily about the role of the Yuan dynasty in China, looking at a little bit of their rule. And on the map that you see in front of you, you see that the Yuan dynasty has unified both that northern and southern part of the Song dynasty. The empire that was previously together, then was divided, and now under the Yuan dynasty is together again. You can see the city of Dadu right here. This becomes the primary Mongol city where they will kind of establish their capital. It's not as far from some of the homeland, so Karakorum. There's also the other khanates, and so while we see from 1206 for some times there is a larger, Mongol empire and one ruler. Over time and into the second generation after Genghis Khan, we see some of the established political systems where the Mongols' conquests have led to rule, and there's a great deal of fragmentation. So, leaders who are not necessarily all getting along, and it really divides up the Mongol society. But just a little bit about the Mongols in China. So you're looking at Kublai Khan. He is the grandson of Genghis Khan, one of many, and he is going to be instrumental in the conquest of China, especially the Southern Song dynasty, and really in becoming the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. He does really adopt a lot of the he kind of fits right into Chinese society and becomes somebody who uses the imperial system that already exists. A lot of the strengths of the Song dynasty are going to be maintained during the Yuan dynasty, and a lot of the use of the imperial system is going to be exactly the same for all intents and purposes. So his role as emperor is going to become similar to previous dynasties. They do develop a sophisticated census, and there is an effort to quantify the people within the Khanate, and also to categorize them. So one thing we do see the Mongols doing is kind of replacing that Confucian social hierarchy with something that becomes new, and it's a little bit more ethnically determined. The Mongols are on top. They become the top dogs. They have, in some cases, a unique language, a unique, style. Everything about them is unique. They are the rulers. There's fewer of them, and connected to them, right underneath them, the group that on the slide is called miscellaneous aliens. It's really the Semuren, these groups of foreigners who are brought in from other places, who are essentially loyal to the Mongols. The northern Chinese, this would include people who might be the Jurchen people, and then the southern Chinese, the Han Chinese, are considered last in the hierarchy, and there are some specific laws that really target the southern Song dynasty, so not being able to carry weapons, for example. So there's some degree of discriminatory laws. Kublai Khan, who is maybe a lover of Chinese culture, is somebody who's almost like a wannabe. There's an aspect of him that almost becomes interested in kind of presenting himself, as Chinese, kind of establishing, this new emperor in the same line of order as others before it, but he's also at the same time feeling threatened by the group of people, the scholars, who had been largely the decision makers in the political system and are largely, picked because of their intellect, and a threat to the Mongols. So one of the tactics that Kublai Khan does is not reinstate the civil service exam. So this feeding system of the exam into bureaucratic jobs, something that was ballooning in the Song dynasty, is something that is not going to be continued into the Mongol reign, at least for some time. He also does create a bunch of laws to try to keep some of the traditional Mongol activities at bay. There's always going to be these contentions about, there's Gurs in the central city, and there's, animals roaming around. And so this cross of two cultures gets ugly, and sometimes Kublai Khan's government does connect to the role of the Semuren. So again, Semuren translate to the people with the colored eyes. These are essentially, foreigners who are brought in from other parts of Mongol conquest, they're brought in to be the bureaucrats. These are trained administrators from maybe Persia who are kind of brought in, loyal to the Mongols, work closely with the Mongols. They're given certain rights and powers, and essentially they completely overstep the literati class. The Confucian scholars are essentially displaced by the Semuren. An example of somebody who was a Semuren is Marco Polo. If you've ever heard of Marco Polo, he's kind of pictured in the image here. He's a young guy who comes with his father and his uncle to China, and he's Italian. So he's from Venice, and he stays in China for a good amount of years, about 20 years, and he works essentially for Kublai Khan. He does a variety of things, travels to India during that time, he does a variety of things, and writes a book about his entire experience. And the book describes the wealth in China, and it becomes a very hot book in Europe after Marco Polo returns. He will get criticized for the book too. He's seen as somebody who likely exaggerated. He's a tall teller, tells all these tall tales all the time. And he's somebody who maybe gets a reputation of exaggerating. So take Marco Polo with a grain of salt. But largely, a lot of Europeans are in disbelief about the way in which China is described. And a lot of historians would argue that some of his descriptions of the cities and the wealth of the economy and the communication systems were kind of spot on. There is a maintenance of a great deal of the tax system, the idea of having mandatory forced labor for some groups. Some people are exempted from this. Artisans, for example, might be exempted, but some groups, have to participate in building a bridge or things like that. There are some separate laws for things like no intermarriage. So Mongols and the Chinese, to some degree, are kept kind of separately. It's not a completely segregated society, but there's elements of that. So something to keep in mind, especially if you're doing the second debate topic. There are some governmental policies that intend to keep the economic system kicking, which is organizing farmers to encourage productivity. There's a great deal of agricultural policies, something to look into, and also investments in public works. Some of this is expensive, things that Kublai Khan ultimately decides to do. There is an uptick in that communication system, so this entire system where information and eventually merchants, move through the society. So there becomes not only these like global trade routes like the Silk Roads, but also these domestic roadways and pathways that are used to move goods and ideas and money, kind of back and forth. Ports are open, so there's a huge interest in maintaining some of that global trade. Something the Mongols are known for is because their empire is so massive and big, like the Abbasids, they have this ability to move things very easily, and that becomes important. They do continue the paper currency. In some cases, you'll see that the Mongols utilize paper currency, and there is a great deal of encouragement of artisans and craftsmen. So something else that's kind of sponsored. There are, however, a whole bunch of conflicts. So just in a broad sense, a few of these conflicts, some things to look for. Again, especially if you're doing that second debate resolution, the group that's probably most significantly impacted would be the Chinese intellectuals, the Confucian scholars. Something that we see a lot of them doing is essentially, building resentment against the Mongols, and fleeing their role as bureaucrats, and often developing some visual art, performance art, and in some cases this art is a reflection of some of the oppression. Some of the productions, for example, might be allegories of earlier times where there's themes of oppression of a foreign group coming in and taking over the society, and it's meant to make a point. And the Mongols, being a group that doesn't always speak the language and doesn't get all of the local nuances, sometimes miss some of that. So the scholarship, the culture, some of those things start to shift with some of the scholars of the day. There is a great deal of arguably tolerance that the Mongols bring to many of the societies that they conquer, in that they allow a great deal of religious tolerance. The religion of the Mongols tended to be more shamanistic, so they have kind of a role for individuals who are, connecting spiritually with some of the individuals in society. But once in China, we see a great number of the Mongols adopt a variety of different types of religions, everything from like Nestorian Christianity to Buddhism. There's a variety of ways in which Confucianism is maintained, at the same time the civil exam is not. And kind of just note that the role of Mongol women is sometimes argued to be a little bit different than the role of women in Song Dynasty China. So where a lot of historians might suggest that women in the Chinese society and the Song Dynasty, especially upper class women, are often not necessarily given as powerful of a public position in society. Some of this might be because the nature of like the family unit, patriarchal kind of bounds are being expressed. We see foot binding in this time. We see Mongol women, who are now going to be living in this region, not embracing foot binding, being important in maintaining some of the cultural styles that were traditional, not necessarily wearing some of the clothing that maybe Chinese women are wearing. So there's like a distinctive Mongol women, rejection of some of the oppression that maybe the Chinese women were facing, and Mongol women oftentimes historians would argue that there is a great deal of egalitarian aspects in the workload that Mongol women and Mongol men have. Mongol women may ride horses, may be involved in loading carts, doing things that would be a little less traditional of a woman's activity. Mongol women do, however, also have a strong role in the family. They're teachers to children. A lot of the learning and education that some of the Mongol rulers had, was specifically because of the women in their lives who brought some of that in. And there are some very powerful Mongol women leaders, as well as Mongol women who, are serving, in other capacities. But, in the other way in which you could maybe make a case that Mongol women don't really have extensive rights is there is a way in which they're heavily objectified by men and given as prizes in the society. There's a great deal of ways in which women are practices like wife stealing, part of early Mongol society, practices like trading women, things like that. So there is there's that aspect. So there's a few things to think about with the way in which we look at the role of women in Mongol society. And there's also this kind of nomadic practices, and there's some talk of using parts of China essentially as pasture land so the Mongols can expand their grazing, and that's eventually overrun and the culture and the societies maintain. But there's actually this discussion of taking some of the area of China and kind of making it into completely pasture land. So there's a great deal of conflict and things like that, as well. And sorry about that. And this very last slide is just to note that, the Mongol rule does change over the course of time. Kublai Khan will die in 1294, so he's not in power that long. It's a really short reign. The reign of the Mongols will exist for some time, almost, not quite, but, almost another, 100 years, not quite, but a significant amount of time. But there's a lot of weak emperors that follow Kublai Khan. So, one thing to note is the Mongols kind of come in with a particular kind of rule for a good amount of decades, but then it's chaotic for the rest of the time. So that's important to keep in mind. The civil exam do get reinstituted on a limited basis in the early 1300s. There are some additional strives that the Mongols make to actually increase the size of this society, and they will invade Japan unsuccessfully. It's expensive, and it probably has a big effect on some of the economic challenges, and the weak political system that starts to happen, especially after the death of Kublai Khan, is not helped by the fact that the scholarly class starts to gain a great deal of power, and you have kind of the Mongol society and the Semuren on one side, the scholarly class that becomes stronger and stronger while the Mongol leadership gets weaker